Hello, welcome to another episode in my, as it turns out, rather long drawn out oral history. I hope to return quite soon to our usual live streams of me answering questions from folk. But since I started, and I'm a person who likes to finish things I start, since I started telling kind of story of my life and sub-stories within it, I'm going to keep going and probably going to do another one of these tomorrow and the next day to try and rush through the story of my life. The only thing that might make things speed up is that in the course of my life, I've done bigger and bigger projects. And when I'm talking about lots of smaller projects that I did earlier in my life, there are lots to talk. There are lots of different things to say about those different projects. By the time we're dealing with a mega project that lasted 5 or 10 years, it's kind of like more like there's this mega project and here's how it happened. So that's my theory, at least. So last time we got to the end of 1982, the beginning of 1983, just sort of the recap. I had from a young age been interested in like being a physicist. So by the time I was like 20 or so, I really was a physicist by all reasonable definitions of the word. I was at Caltech, kind of faculty member doing physics research. But then at that time, I'd sort of started my big project to building SMP, a big computer system. That was my first big computer system. I started in the end of 1979. First version came out in the middle of 1981. And by then, kind of transitioned from doing research in fundamental physics, particle physics, cosmology, and so on, to studying simple programs and how they behave and things like cellular automata. You know, I think at the time, people I knew who were like, how can you be leaving physics? You know, you're one of the bright young characters in physics. And physics was at that time sort of the top dog field of them all type thing. And I think I remember one comment from a chap called Pierre Ramond, who was a physicist at Caltech, who was kind of like, how can you be leaving this? And then it's like, and then he was like, he kind of understood, oh, you're always doing unexpected things, like not continuing to do sort of traditional physics and so on and doing something different instead. Well, so by 1982, I'd had this whole big intellectual property meltdown with Caltech, and I'd started my first company, which by that point turned into what was called Inference Corporation. And I had left Caltech, was going to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, kind of recruited by a chap called Harry Wolff, who was the director there, who really wanted to start a kind of school of computational science in the rather small operation that was the Institute for Advanced Study. So this must have been October of 1982. The only time I've ever driven across the country. I started from LA, and my first stop was Los Alamos, where I was a consultant in the theory division and hung out there for a little while. Then went east to Bell Labs and was kind of hanging out there as a consultant, partly in physics and mathematics, partly in the computing and Unix development operation there. And then by probably, I forget, maybe January or so of 1983, started at the Institute for Advanced Study. So let's see, at the time, I was kind of energetically working on cellular automata, simple programs, what they do. I kind of transitioned from using big mini computer, so-called mini computer, except they were in air-conditioned rooms and the size of many large refrigerator units computers, to using workstation computers, particularly ones from Sun Microsystems, a company that I'd interacted with a fair amount. So I arrived at the Institute. I had a Sun workstation on my desk. There was a VAX mini computer down in the basement, about which there were many arguments. Should it run Unix, which I said was the way of the future, or VMS, which you may have never heard of, which was not the way of the future. It was a big kind of my first kind of big political interaction at the Institute for Advanced Study was that question. A chap called John Bacall, who was an astronomer there, who was very much on the VMS side of that. I forget what actually happened in the end. I actually forget what happened. But in any case, John Bacall, I would say, didn't become one of my favorite people, but I did enjoy at least one story that he told, which was when was first at the Institute. Kurt Gödel was still there, and apparently John Bacall was doing all kinds of stuff with, I don't know, counting stars and galaxies and things. Not that exciting in my view, but in any case, apparently he explained all this to Kurt Gödel, who said, well, that's all very nice, young man, but, said Kurt Gödel, I do not believe in natural science. So spoken as a true Platonist of some kind. In any case, meanwhile, my company, by then Inference Corporation, was out in Los Angeles. I was out in Princeton, New Jersey. It was kind of the venture capital folk who had by then invested, I don't remember how many rounds, one or two rounds of maybe two rounds by then of investment in the company, were like, all this stuff about symbolic computation, no, we don't want to be doing that. We want to be doing the thing of the future, which was AI done with expert systems. And so the company really went in that direction. And it was one of those cases where it was like, no, you guys just don't get it. And well, that's the last time I've taken investment money for any company I've been running. And because I thought it was like, yes, the young venture capitalists, they're sure they know what to do. Turns out to be totally the wrong thing, but let's not worry about that. In any case, back in that time, the Inference Corporation went off doing expert system shell type stuff. Meanwhile, SMP was getting fairly successfully sold in a bunch of commercial and academic places. But I was decreasingly involved with that. The expert systems side of the business, expert systems were, the thing that was going to take over everything back in the early 1980s. Inference did a few notable things. I mean, I think Inference built the first sort of credit rating kind of credit rating system for people. They built the first fraud detection system for American Express. I think they built a bunch of stuff for NASA, trying to figure out, was it okay to launch a space shuttle or not? Well, in any case, so a variety of projects. It was a rather a lumpy business in the sense that, either a project would come in and it was big or nothing would come in. The SMP business was really the cash cow of the business because it was a fairly stable business selling software to the obvious organizations, so to speak. In any case, I have to say that with Inference Corporation, by that point, many things had happened where I was like, there was a question of what's the company going to do? And I was like, the people who I originally brought in, who was managing it at that point, were like, we're sure we should do this. And I was like, that really isn't going to work. And I kept on being right, which was very frustrating to me. I mean, I remember one of the things was about sales, our sales operation. And it was kind of like, let's have a sort of global presence. Let's put salespeople in all these different cities and so on. And the problem was that those people were kind of, they were sort of semi-technical folk. And when it came to actually closing a sale, a substantial sale, somebody from LA would have to fly out and kind of talk to the customer anyway. And these people were kind of semi-technical. They were kind of hard to motivate in a work from home type mode in those days. And it never really worked very well. There was one chap in Texas who was kind of the salesperson who knew the least, who did the best, because he would just do the relationship management with customers and then bring somebody in who actually knew what they were talking about to deal with the technical side of it. But in any case, that was something where I had said this isn't going to work, and it didn't work. Rather expensive, didn't work. But in any case, So, well, there I was basically doing basic science on things like cellular automata. It really helped at the institute. Some simple things helped. Like I had this printer that was a sort of a bitmap high resolution printer. A bit later, I would get a laser printer, um, but that was when you're visualizing things like cellular automata, you can see them on a nice bitmap screen. But then, and that was kind of the first time I think I was really able to see these things at high resolution on a bitmap screen, and you could print them out. And my method for sort of putting things in papers was very low tech, involved multiple photocopying and scotch taping and things like this. I will say that in terms of bitmap displays and laser printers, I think the first time I saw that technology was 1979, probably, visiting a chap called Bill Gosper, who was then working at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. It was the place where the graphical user interface bitmap display thing was invented. And I have to say, I remember seeing that, and they even had a color laser printer at that time. Xerox being a copier company, they were really forward in those kinds of things. It was an experimental color laser printer, but I remember seeing this bitmap display with windows and so on for the first time, and being like, well, what happens if the thing you want is in the window behind the one that you have stuck in this place on the screen? It's like, this is never going to work, I thought. Well, of course, I was wrong. We use Windows all the time, although I do tend to remember that moment back all those years ago, whenever I'm in this situation where it's like I'm trying to paste things from one window and it's covered up by another window and so on. But in any case, that really helped in terms of my the fact that I could make these high resolution pictures of cellular automata. And I really started to identify kind of the big picture of how cellular automata behave, and kind of identify these sort of four classes of cellular automata and behavior that sort of characterize the complexity of their behavior. So that was a thing that I was doing in early 1983. Then I had set up, I guess in the fall of 82, I had, maybe when I was visiting Los Alamos, I had decided, okay, let's do a conference about cellular automata. Well, cellular automata had a very messy history. They had been invented many, many different times, in many different forms, with many different names and so on. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have a conference where we just invite everybody who has worked on these things that I call cellular automata? That particular branch of history goes back to von Neumann and Ulam, who called them, well, actually a person called Arthur Burks called them that. But that was, he came out of the John von Neumann, Stan Ulam kind of development. But there were many other branches. We called them things like homogeneous structures and automorphisms of the shift, and a bunch of other names which were not obviously identifiable, but they were actually the same thing. So by that point, I had gone through the Science Citation Index and the online version of that, and I tried to find sort of everybody who'd done work on related things. And so I invited them all to this conference at Los Alamos. At that time, that conference was done as a chap called Doan Farmer, who was at Los Alamos at that time, a postdoc there. And he was sort of the person who was enthusiastic for these kinds of things. I have to say, at that time, he made one of those comments that you kind of sometimes remember these comments people make to you. He said to me, it's just not fair for you to work on things. You're too efficient. Subsequently, he came to kind of be more upset about that than he might have been, and quite aggressive about the whole thing. But for then, it was just like, it's unfair for you to work on things. You're too efficient. I have to say, I'm proud of the fact in the decades since, I think I have become vastly more efficient at working on projects, probably by at least a factor of 10, possibly because I've spent all those years building tools to make me more efficient at doing these kinds of things. But anyway, we organized this conference along with a chap called Tom Toffoli, who was connected to Ed Fredkin, and who I guess I'd met on Fredkin's Island back at the beginning of 82. And but the conference was really quite a wonderful thing, because all these people had never met each other. They didn't know that any of this other work was going on. And it was really a very dynamic thing. I remember a few bits and pieces from that. Bill Gosper, who I just mentioned, in connection with Xerox PARC, was there and introduced his so-called Hashlife algorithm for doing fast updating of game of life things. I think who else was notable who was there? Was the first time I ever heard Stuart Hameroff, who became quite well known and sort of talking about quantum mechanics in the brain, was talking about microtubules and cellular automata. I actually hadn't seen Stuart since that time until a couple of months ago when I saw him 2 times in the course of a month or so. But in any case, he's still saying the same things. I don't really believe them, but that's a different story. Then also at that event, we had Stan Ulam give the after-dinner speech about kind of origins of cellular automata. And John von Neumann, a friend of mine, was a science writer at the time, interviewed Stan Ulam. And I think he may have said the same thing to me as well, but the transcript of her interview has this comment about how, to you all, von Neumann must seem like Gauss, some figure in the distant past. But to him, Stan Ulam, he was a person who was, this lively fellow who he had known very personally for many years. In any case, that was, I think another person I think I probably met at that conference was Danny Hillis, who will show up further in these stories. Danny was, had been, I think was still was a graduate student at MIT at that time, kind of spinning off a company called Thinking Machines Corporation, which was, whose goal was to make massively parallel computers that would, at first implement the AI ideas of Marvin Minsky, although really mostly be massively parallel computers, and cellular automata being things that have many different cells. They're sort of a natural fit with this idea of massively parallel computers. It wasn't the first time people had thought about making computers that had very large number of independent processing elements, but this was a more sophisticated case, and one where sort of the idea was to be able to route information sort of from one side of the machine to the other in an effective way, rather than just locally, like in a cellular automaton. In any case, then, later in, what was happening at that time? I mean, I was energetically working on cellular automata. I kind of had this hobby of doing tech consulting for a varied collection of large companies, small companies, some investment funds, and so on. I think Schlumberger remained kind of a place that I was doing consulting. I remember one notable conversation I felt with a chap who would later go on to be the CEO of Schlumberger, but at that time was running some division of it, talking to them about basic research and so on, and saying, if you really want a basic research operation, take some of the money you're making from oil right then, because they were at that moment the world's most profitable company, and put it in an endowment and never touch it. Because otherwise, as soon as the price of oil goes down, you're going to take that money, you're going to close down basic research, and whatever you built up is going to die. Well, of course, they didn't take my advice, and that's exactly what happened. But so it goes. I think I was giving pretty good advice generally to the outfits I was advising. I remember some sort of investment kinds of things of due diligence on various companies that sometimes were sensible, but often were profoundly not. Well, meanwhile, actually, I'm remembering there was an initiative somehow, gosh, when was that? I think that was earlier than that. It must have been maybe 82. Was an initiative actually with a few of the other Inference Corporation folk and some other people I knew, was kind of a make a new language type initiative, which really didn't last past a few day workshop. But it was sort of interesting because at the time people were saying, oh, why are you doing something like this? Everybody knows the language of the future is Ada, the language being then supposedly mandated by the Department of Defense in the US, a language of immense complexity. I don't think it was ever properly implemented. And eventually people sort of found the loophole of, well, we'll write something in C or Fortran or something, and then automatically translate it to some horrible version of Ada, just to say we're satisfying the requirements. I remember actually in that meeting, the two sort of things of the future that were Ada is the language of the future, and the idea of 3D microprocessors. Instead of having a small number of layers, have the thing be just this sort of dense pack of stuff. It always amuses me when I hear that idea again, because that's one of those constantly in the future type ideas. The it In any case, the thing that um, so. Well, 83, I'm trying to remember what was happening in that time. I was going to lots of conferences and things. Um, and for some reason, I got invited to a lot of theoretical biology conferences. Theoretical biology was having one of its sort of renaissance periods in the 1980s. I always thought it was somewhat because the word cellular automata had cellular in it. But so I got to know kind of the folks who were sort of the leading lights of theoretical biology at that time. It was a very small field, but it was interesting to see. I never really did serious work in theoretical biology. I tried and didn't really get anywhere at that time. I remember also at Los Alamos meeting this. Well, there was a chap called George Bell who I knew decently well, and a chap called Walter Goad who were telling me, "Oh yes, there's a thing called GenBank where we're going to collect all these genetic sequences," and that eventually became NCBI and sort of eventually sort of spawned things like the Human Genome Project. But that wasn't. It was like, well, we're getting these sequences of a few genes at that time, and eventually that scaled up. In any case, then I think 1984 was an interesting year for me. I trying to remember the order in which things happened, but yeah, one thing that at the Institute for Advanced Study, Harry Wolff had been continuing his campaign to sort of have this whole computation initiative, and had built out this beautiful office space, and which I was the sort of the recipient of. This turned out to be, in many ways, a disaster. I hadn't really understood the politics of academia as clearly before that time, but I think this piece of office space was kind of the thing that doomed Harry's plan. Although it was very lovely. It's actually the only time in my life that I've ever systematically worked in the office rather than migrating rapidly to working at home. I've been somehow a work from home guy pretty much my whole life. But that was the one time where the office space was so lovely that I worked there. And actually, I remember there was a chap called Ed Regis, who was a science writer, who came to write a book at that time called "Who Got Einstein's Office?" I think has a chapter about me in that book. And I don't know how much he did. I actually don't know. I don't know where Einstein's office had been. I think it was downstairs from the offices that we had, which were kind of up on the top floor of the main building of the Institute. The main building of the Institute, I think, had been an insane asylum in its earlier history, but had then been refitted as a top-of-the-line research institute. I think at the time there were well, let's see. I had started accumulating a small group of people, a chap called Norman Packer, a chap called Rob Shaw, some others, who were kind of working supposedly with me. In some cases, I actually did collaborate with them. In other cases, they were doing sort of their own projects. At the Institute, there were a number of people that I interacted with. There was a physicist named Roger Dashin. I have to say, one of the things that had happened at the Institute was something that I kind of learned from, which is the Institute, its director had been Robert Oppenheimer. He was not the first director, but an early director of the Institute, and he'd been the director there until he died in 1968 or so. When he was there, he did a lot of high-risk hiring. He hired a lot of very talented people, and some of them, they hired them quite young. Some of them worked out really well. Some of them did not. I would say that the ones who worked out the best probably had migrated away from the Institute by the time I was there. And sometimes it was, I definitely got a lost soul vibe from the ones who were there. I mean, there was a chap, oh gosh, there was a person, my gosh, what was his name? was a person who'd worked on von Neumann's computer project, who was still sort of hanging around there in a very undefined way. My gosh, what was his name? I don't remember. But anyway, there was some chap called Roger Dashin, who was a physicist who'd sort of lost interest in a lot of the kind of particle physics stuff he had been doing earlier on. And then uh, he, by the time I was there, his greatest interest, I think, was consulting for the Navy on underwater sound propagation. And I spent ages trying to convince him that's what you should really do. Eventually he left the institute after I was there and went to UC San Diego. Unfortunately, died soon thereafter. But in any case, there were other characters in the mix. There was also Freeman Dyson, who I'm not sure was a great fan of mine. I mean, Freeman would come to lunch kind of every day. I would go to lunch. They had a very lovely cafeteria with a very fine, I think, French chef at the time. It was great. Well, it was great, except that, for example, to give you sort of a vibe of the institute, they would also have dinners from time to time. And at dinners, you would kind of sign up for the dinner, and you would sign up. And if you signed up, as I discovered, if you signed up on your own, you were assigned a single table, which was just you. I remember the first time I was there, I had this single table, and not far away was this older French academic who was probably a visitor to the institute. The institute is mostly has visiting folk. There's a small collection of longer term people, but which I was a sample, but mostly it's visiting folk and sort of mid-career and so on academics. But I remember this chap, very French chap, with eating his dinner on his own, in a very dignified way. And the concept of, oh, you could have a conversation across to another table was definitely not there. So the Institute was a very, that kind of place where people went to kind of hide out for a year and to work on some great project of theirs and so on. But anyway, there would be this lunch every day, and Freeman would show up and I would show up. And it seemed like a repeating pattern that Freeman would show up and say, I have this great idea. Actually, usually wasn't his idea. It was usually an idea that he'd got from reading something or another, as it turned out. And then he would explain it, and I would say, Freeman, that can't possibly be right. And he would kind of curl up and make some, and sort of somewhat defend it. But I don't think that probably endeared me greatly to him. Well, subsequently, also at that time, my gosh, there were all these different characters. I had a number of physics friends, a chap called Larry Yaffe, who was at the university, a chap called Malcolm Perry, who will be encountered again, I think, in these stories. And actually, Malcolm Perry must have been right around that time, had a graduate student named Nathan Meerwald. And the notable thing there was that I didn't know Nathan, but except I got this message, could Nathan and some friends of his come over to the Institute some evening and talk to me about some startup that they were doing? It's like, okay, fine. They come and they describe, I must have been 83, 84 maybe. And they're talking about how they've developed this Windows system for PCs. Well, that was at a time when Microsoft had announced Windows, the operating system, but not shipped it. At the time, MS-DOS, the command line oriented operating system, was still the main thing. And I was saying to Nathan, you're just not going to be able to compete with Microsoft. Why don't you just sell your operation to Microsoft and make a go of that? Well, a few years went by, and it turns out he did exactly that, and then ascended the ranks at Microsoft, eventually becoming their CTO, and did very well for himself from that. I think he finally got fired because he'd taken his top of the line private plane to Patagonia to go look for dinosaur skeletons, which was a big hobby of his, and had just dug up a T-Rex or something right when there was some emergency back at the office, and it's like, I'm going to do my T-Rex, not do the emergency at the office. but that was years ago. In any case, that was kind of one of well, a graduate student of Malcolm's. There were a few other stories there to be told or not. Well, then 1984. One of the things that happened was the that it was I got this nice laser printer, high resolution laser printer. Must have been in May of 1984, and I was like, "This is cool! I can print out lots of nice cellular automaton pictures." And then it was, I think, June 1st, 1984. I decided I was going on some trip to Europe, and let me print out some pictures of cellular automata at high resolution, particularly Rule 30, which I kind of had made pictures of earlier, but hadn't really paid much attention to. So I print this out, I get on the plane, and I realize this Rule 30 thing really is a lot more interesting than I thought. There's something really non-trivial going on here. So I go to Europe. I was actually going to a conference put on by the Nobel Foundation somewhere in the north of Sweden. I do remember that I wound up at Stockholm Airport, and these were different times. You couldn't just look things up on the web. And it turned out the flight to northern Sweden that I'd had was cancelled because it was a Swedish holiday, but sort of nobody knew that and whatever. And so I ended up driving up Sweden at a rather high speed and to this conference. But in any case, at that conference, it's kind of interesting because there were transcripts of some discussion sessions at that conference, and I'm sort of charmed by the fact that I went in 2 days from kind of seeing Rule 30 to talking about the significance of the behavior of sort of the intrinsic randomness of Rule 30 and so on. And it was something where, having been primed for the idea of sort of intrinsic randomness and what I would soon call computational irreducibility, having been primed for that, it really was something that we could start talking about very quickly. I remember at that conference, well, many interesting characters there. I think there was the time when Benoit Mandelbrot who was just very keen on winning prizes for something, was at that point sort of campaigning for the Nobel Prize for physics. Later, I think it would be economics. I remember saying to Benoit, "I just don't know why you're so interested in prizes. Seems to me that any subject that's really where there's really things to discover, there won't yet be a prize for it. And there's a good reason there isn't a prize for fractals, because it's a thing that is a new sort of emerging area that doesn't really have a place in an existing field." Well, in any case, then I think the next thing I remember from 1984 was I got somehow set up to write an article for Scientific American, and the article was part of some special issue about computer software, and my piece was supposed to be about computer software in science and engineering, or science and technology, maybe science and mathematics. I think computer software and science and mathematics, and so in trying to sort of explain what was going on with things like cellular automata, I invented this term, computational irreducibility, which I have much used since then. And that was kind of invented as an expository thing. And actually, the things I wrote in that article and the pictures I made, I have sort of used versions of those pictures over and over again in the time since then. I think the thing that, well, in that article had a number of, I invented computational irreducibility. That was an article. I remember Scientific American at the time would be like, yes, let's get these sort of frontline scientists to write things, but then the actual editors of Scientific American will do most of the real writing. But I didn't want that. And it was a big sort of push and pull of me kind of insisting that the thing be written exactly as I had written it. I remember sitting with the chap, Peter Brown was his name, who was the editor, who was dealing with the article. I sat with him until 2 in the morning in New York City, the day that the article had to go off to the printer, so to speak. And I was like changing back things at the last minute, and it finally did go out as I had written it, so to speak. Although it probably got improved by some pushback about lots of kinds of issues there. I do remember in that article there was a nice page of examples of SMP, and I kind of learnt from that the extent to which people, when they read things that were kind of intended for sort of intellectual reading, absorb them differently from things that are like ads for things. Because that page was read by many people, but not by people who are like, I'm going to go buy SMP type thing. I will say that the company Inference Corporation was at that point running ads for SMP that were just dreadful. But in any case, the that article also was a time when I had a kind of a complicated experience, because cellular automata, among their many other uses, I realized that Rule 30 was an interesting source of cryptography, was an interesting crypto system that you could use to do potentially quite powerful encryption. Well, at the time, there was a big sort of thing going of, encryption was something for governments and not something for the people, so to speak. And it was a question of, would things that were methods of encryption get classified? And it was all a big kind of complicated story about those kinds of things. And so I was, in the end, I sort of just put in this article in Zenov American some comment about how these things can be used for cryptography. And I'm like, I'm not going to elaborate on this, but I'm also not going to put it in a form where people can sort of argue, is this paper, should it be classified or whatever else? I had the experience actually of giving a talk for a research organization, part of the National Security Agency, I think a little bit before that time. And it was a very interesting group. And I gave a talk about cellular automata. They said practically nothing. And then the person who was the director of the place said to me afterwards, he said, you should go and look at some of those papers written by particular people particularly a chap called Gustav Hedlund. The papers written in the late 1950s. He said, you'll find some interesting stuff there. And he was right. I did. And what came to light later, and I actually met Gustav Hedlund late in his life in a very kind of slightly bizarre interaction, because he really didn't, there had been work done on cellular automata as part of the cryptography effort. Actually, they were what led to the S boxes of the DES encryption system via a not terribly circuitous route. So there had been relevant work done by some rather good mathematicians. Also, a person called Andrew Gleason was another one who worked on this. And they had written kind of open papers about the mathematics of these things, but kind of the use case was very much NSA-style cryptography. I will say at that time, at the Institute, in addition to some of these physicists, I had gotten to know some mathematicians who I had a very good time with, particularly a mathematician called John Milnor, whose office was right down by mine. Actually, the sequence of offices was kind of fun. We had our rather lovely office space, and then there was a chap called Otto Neugebauer, who and then Jack Milnor. And Otto Neugebauer, I would see him kind of wandering around and say hi a lot, and it's kind of a white-haired old fellow. And his office was just full of card catalogs. And I really had no idea what he did. And I should have just asked him. And, if it had been modern times, I would have looked it up, but I didn't know. And Otto Neugebauer was at that time kind of the world expert on Babylonian astronomy. And those card catalogs were like what was on lots of Babylonian tablets, kind of decoding them. Now, in the kind of small world and ironies of the future, my son Christopher has done a lot of work on Babylonian astronomy, making direct use of what Otto Neugebauer had worked on. But I sadly didn't know that part of Otto Neugebauer. I just said hi, every day type thing, without knowing any of what was in those card catalogs. But then Jack Milnor had this office which was piled absolutely high with papers. There was no space for anything. There was just papers on the floor, on the table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And but he got very interested in cellular automata, and he kind of had the point of view, these are interesting systems. We're going to be able to solve them with math. Also, a chap called Bill Thurston, who was a very good mathematician at the institute at the university, Princeton University, also got interested in these things. But I interacted with Jack pretty much every day on these things, and he would regularly leave me his notes about things he'd figured out. He also, to his credit, as a then not a particularly young mathematician, started writing programs in C and so on, and running them on the computers I had, and all this kind of thing. But in the end, Jack Milnor and Bill Thurston both basically said, we can't figure out anything about cellular automata. We've tried Jack had tried for a couple of years. We really can't figure out anything. And I realized years later that sort of my main achievement probably was realizing that the very fact that they couldn't figure out anything interesting was itself very interesting, and was kind of the origin of phenomena like computational irreducibility. I was always very charmed by one thing about Jack, which was that I would be trying to figure out a bunch of math stuff, and I would ask Jack, how does this work? He said, I don't know. And then I would go and I would eventually find something in the library. And what would I find? But the definitive paper on that area was written by none other than Jack Milnor. And I always used to say, he's a person who's forgotten more mathematics than anybody else has known, so to speak. But I do understand now how that can happen, that one can write something which sort of is the definitive treatment of this or that thing and forget its details because it goes quite fast, and you don't remember all those things. It's the things that go slowly that you remember all the details of. In any case, the Institute had developed quite intense politics, particularly, I think, around office space and around the general sort of funding for a computational effort. And I think there was what was it? There was the edict that I think was a Freeman Dyson edict that was all computers at the Institute should be equally accessible to everyone, which didn't make a lot of sense because, for example, the computers I had that I'd gotten from Sun Microsystems were they were kind of my computers, and they were also single user computers. So even if that had been a good idea, it was impractical. And meanwhile, John Bacall was having this big campaign to sort of divert whatever computer funds would come to the Institute to his operation. And he had a chap called Pete Hutt, who was kind of his offering for, and we can do something computational too. I actually enjoyed Pete. I think I remember one time he was working on gravitational n-body problems and things, and I think he was talking to me about how do you make an algorithm that does this, because you have n squared type things. And I'm like, you could probably do something where you aggregate things in some hierarchical fashion. I think that I don't know exactly what the path was, but that eventually became the Barnes-Hutt method for doing n-body simulations. But Pete Hutt later stuck around at the Institute, in the end, much to everybody's chagrin. And I think it's been a long time. He went off into doing things, not traditional science kinds of things, which didn't really fit in with the Institute. But that was many years later. At the time, he was kind of John Bacall's person to say, really, we astronomers can do computer stuff too. You should give the money to us. Anyway, meanwhile, I was sort of trying to build up a larger group at the Institute, and that was increasingly messy. I mean, Harry Wolff was sort of fighting these various battles. It was always kind of peculiar because Harry, I would sort of interact with him at the Institute, and then I would hear from people out in the kind of the tech investment world, because he kind of had a double life. He was also advising a bunch of investment funds and things like this. And he was always a little bit afraid, I think, that I would sort of connect the two parts. I mean, he talked to me about the two parts of his life, but that I would tell anybody else at the Institute. He would say, don't tell the other people at the Institute I'm doing these other things. But he would give me advice from time to time. He'd said, one of the things he was a believer in is a different tie for a different occasion. So he was like, depending on whether I'm doing this in this investment fund or talking to academics, put on a different tie. It was kind of lost on me because I wasn't wearing ties at that time or since, but it was kind of an amusing point of view. In any case, so then probably in the, what was it, in the summer of, must have been summer of 84 or so, Thinking Machines Corporation had kind of gotten funded, a lot of government money in it and so on. It was, I was kind of doing consulting for it. The um, 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 and in and was spent much of the summer in Boston at the then fledgling Thinking Machines Corporation, which was a very energized operation at that time. It was operating out of a kind of a country house in the Boston area called the Payne House, and it was very charming because it had it had all these machines all over the place, and there were just cables everywhere, and sort of rooms in the house which were obscurely used for this or that group. Dick Feynman was also one of the consultants there, and his son Carl Feynman worked at the company. And there are many other interesting people there. A chap called Brewster Kahle, who I've known for many years, who went on to found the Internet Archive, was another person who was kind of a young operative there. Many other people who've had notable careers. Another consultant there was Jack Schwartz, who was a mathematician from NYU. And many others. David Mumford, I remember. But Danny Hillis was the CTO, and a woman called Cheryl Handler was the CEO. It was an energetic, if slightly crazy place. I mean, I consulted for them for a while, and maybe the next year, I remember Dick Feynman and I talking about, the strategy this company has is crazy. And, they're trying to make $1 million single user AI computers. This is just not the right strategy. And Dick Feynman saying to me, what do we know about running companies? Just, we should just hide away and do physics. And we were at that time actually working on a project that one of the projects being worked on was, I think I'd suggested, was sort of taking seriously the idea of quantum computers and figuring out whether we could at least make, even if we couldn't compute, could we at least make a good random number generator with quantum mechanics? And realizing that, well, actually, no, it was difficult because you had to kind of, after you measured that quantum bit, you had to kind of randomize the detector and so on. And we were kind of close to having some kind of inequalities for how fast you could get quantum bits out of something. Never ended up writing it up, unfortunately. In any case, let's see, I'm trying to remember those times. I mean, the other thing that was most notable was the connection machine computer by then had been built and so on. And it was the big issue was, could you get data from this side of the computer? It was a 65,000 processor or a 16,000 processor computer. It was a 16-dimensional hypercube. And it was a question of, if you sent a message from this processor to this other processor, what would it take to get there? And it was kind of always a big thing about how these messages would be sent sort of locally, but nevertheless get to where they were going to. And there had been actually, Dick Feynman was responsible for a kind of statistical mechanics argument for how much buffering was needed to kind of let the messages be delivered. They were making special purpose chips, which was a hard time putting a lot of memory on them. So it was good to have small buffers on these things. But in any case, there had been a summer student who was actually working with me, who had done kind of a simulation which suggested that actually this would not work, that there would be a long time tail of delivery times. I think in the end, the long time tail of delivery times was what probably more than anything sunk many of the things which the connection machine might have done. But it was it was something, well, anyway, let's not get into the technicalities of it. Um, it was a time when Thinking Machines was very much a very lovely, in many ways, aspirational company. I mean, it had rented this very nice office space, and Cheryl Handler, the CEO, had made sure that it was the interior design was quite lovely. And Cheryl was very much of a quality, a person who pushed quality. She wanted the best people, the best interior design, the best industrial design for the computer and so on. I remember when the first computers were being delivered, that lots of employees were like, "Oh my gosh, Cheryl is having us gift wrap the documentation for the thing," and which I thought was rather nice, actually. I have to tell one more story about the connection machine. It was back when it was first sort of under construction. Guess I was in Boston, must have been maybe that first summer, and I went to see a movie with Danny Hillis. The movie was War Games, and the War Games movie has this computer in it that has a large collection of flashing lights. So we're walking out of this movie, and I remember the movie theater. I remember we're walking out, and I turned to Danny and I said, "Maybe your computer should have flashing lights too." Well, that ended up becoming one of the most notable features of the connection machine. It was this kind of black cube with red flashing lights all over it. I sometimes have said rather unkindly that the connection machine became the world's leading direct-to-museum computer, because it's shown up in lots of museums, because it is a very lovely piece of industrial design, mostly done by a person called Tamiko Thiel, that was that's very striking, and its flashing lights are an important part of it. In any case, well, let's see. I think this takes us to well, by 1984, I was very much on this idea of sort of computation as a foundational concept, and the features of computation as foundationally important to modeling natural science. And I had this paper called Undecidability and Intractability in Theoretical Physics, which kind of pushed this idea of kind of the physical Church-Turing thesis and so on, and also the idea of computational irreducibility. That was followed by a little paper about origins of randomness in physical systems that thoroughly upset the aforementioned Doe and Farmer, who had really been pushing the kind of chaos theory view of things and had been sort of theming himself as Mr. Chaos, so to speak. And really what I was pointing out was the idea of that randomness came from sensitive dependence on initial conditions just wasn't the story. It was randomness coming from sort of intrinsic computational processes. And that was caused sort of a divergence there. Okay, so I had worked on well, I worked on many things at that time. I was really quite interested in how this might be relevant to biology and thinking about adaptive versions of cellular automata. I never managed to make that work at that time. Many years later, in fact, just last year, I finally did manage to make that work, given new intuition from machine learning, and it's been rather exciting as a way to understand the foundations of biology. But at that time, I didn't manage to make that work. Meanwhile, this is now in 1985, sort of political strife at the Institute, plus my kind of desire to kind of grow the operation, led me to start looking for other pastures, so to speak. And I sort of decided this idea of generating complexity from simple rules and so on, this is an important paradigmatic idea that has all sorts of implications across all kinds of existing sciences. It's really something new, something that needs its own sort of institutional structure. And so I sort of had this idea of a complexity institute. At the time, there was this field called computational complexity theory, which was big. And so I wanted to avoid the collision with that, even though by complexity there, they more mean difficulty than things that look complicated and so on. So I tended to call what I was doing complex systems research. But so I kind of thought, okay, let me try and invent a research center, an institute for complex systems research, and let me go around the country and kind of figure out where should I put this thing. And at the time, I would say I was a fairly viewed as a pretty successful science operative. And so it was kind of like I could, get a job in any of the sort of obvious top universities and other type places. But I was more ambitious than that. I was like, I don't just want a job for me. I want to start this institute and I want to get jobs for 5 other people or something and start this whole operation. I mean, I have to say that back in those days, this was in 1984 or so, a little bit before that, I remember must have been, gosh, yeah, it must have been the summer of 1984. I remember giving some talk about, I was 25 years old by that time, and I was right around I think I had that birthday twice because I flew to some conference in Japan at that time. But in any case, crossed the international date line. But right around that time was I remember giving some sort of after dinner speech about cellular automata and complexity and all those kinds of things. And I thought to myself afterwards, oh my gosh, I could spend the rest of my life giving the same speech. I've got to do something different. And the irony of it is that while for a long time I did do different things, putting up a picture of Rule 30 and showing and talking about sort of how it generates complexity from simple rules is something I have done over and over and over again. I mean, in some communities, that's now timed out. Everybody knows that now. But it took 4 decades. And in many cases, they don't. And so, unfortunately, my oh my gosh, I could be doing this for the rest of my life has to some extent come to pass. I have to say, I remember that trip to Japan. One of the things that was notable about it was going to a World's Fair there and seeing first sort of flat screen displays. Took many years for those to become sort of commonplace because the defect rate was too high, something one didn't know at the time. I can tell other stories about that. Remember the American pavilion of that sort of World's Fair type thing featured a Lisp machine very prominently, and a woman with full sort of cowboy getup who was supposed to be tending the Lisp machine, but the thing kept on printing out, "You have lost your last chance to garbage collect." And she had no idea what to do. Nobody had briefed her on this, so I was able to help it out, so to speak, and say, you just got to restart it. In any case, so in 1985, I guess one of my big activities from a sort of organizational point of view was starting to kind of go around and figure out where could I place this institute. I talked to many universities, and it was kind of interesting. It was an interesting sort of Rorschach test for the nature of universities. Some of them have changed since then, but it was sort of charming. I remember Harvard was like, well, we're interested in you, but we don't want any of these other kind of messy characters you're thinking of hiring. Or, MIT was kind of like, well, if you give a government, if you bring government money in something, whatever, you can create whatever you want. Or Boston University, I remember had a very entrepreneurial president at that time who was like, we can spend a bunch of money on this. It's but we're investing our endowment in all sorts of places. I think at that time was a lot of it got invested in a doomed biotech company. And then, I remember University of California, which was, seemed to have like 100-year plan for how they would gradually migrate the university. Berkeley had been their first campus. They ran out of space in Berkeley, and then UCLA, and then at that time, UC San Diego was the big thing that was coming up, and they had other ones that they were sort of imagining for the future. And I remember that sort of talking to the chap, a person called Cal Moore, who was one of the poobahs of University of California about this. I had a very, very, very interesting conversation actually about sort of their global plans. And I think then was UC San Diego was the main sort of target place at that time. I have to say, I'm remembering talking of that chap who was also involved in this thing called Math Sciences Research Institute, which I remember visiting, probably must have been 83 or something. Their very first conference was about, it was actually about dynamical systems theory and related things. And sort of my cellular automaton stuff was kind of I would say, a significant feature of that conference. But one of the things that was always interesting at conferences in those days was doing demos. Well, computers that could run the things I was doing weren't exactly portable in those days. Although a Sun workstation was something you could put in the trunk of a car and drive somewhere and set it up. I remember at that conference, it was when a chap called S.S. Churn was the director of MSRI, and MSRI was still part of Berkeley University at that time before it sort of moved up to its fancy location at the top of a hill in more modern times. But is the demo going to show up? Well, there was a tremendous habit of John Gage, who'd been sort of the first sort of big evangelist for Sun Microsystems, would at the last minute show up with his, with the Sun workstation computer in the back of the car. I remember that happened quite internationally. I remember being at some conference, I think it was in the south of France, and it was like, I'd said, send this computer if you want, I'd like to do this demo. It can show off your technology, and nothing. And eventually, who should show up but John Gage in person with a computer in tow at that conference. Actually, I seem to remember that was the conference where I first met John Conway, among other people. But that's probably a different story. I think so. And then, well, other places we went. I sort of explored many other universities. I think maybe University of Michigan was, yes, that was maybe, no, I think that was not on that iteration. And one was University of Illinois, and actually a chap called David Pines, who was a big fixture at University of Illinois, had sort of said, oh, I'd given various criteria. I kind of like the countryside rather than big cities. And I liked, university with certain characteristics. And he said, you're going to end up wanting to do something at University of Illinois, which he was in the end right about. Actually, David Pines had done me another kind of favor. The first big paper I published about cellular automata was published in Reviews in Modern Physics, and he was kind of the editor there and kind of shepherded its publication there. But anyway, after going around to all these different places, well, I guess that deal didn't sort of close until 1986. It was like, okay, University of Illinois is going to be the place. And we got a bunch of faculty positions, we got a building, a bunch of startup money, and to start this thing called the Center for Complex Systems Research. Well, meanwhile, at the time, this is 85, 86, on the science side of things, one of the things I was doing was, okay, the connection machine computer had been built for sort of AI purposes. I was like, that's not going to work, but really it can be used for a lot of very practical things like fluid dynamics. How can it be used for fluid dynamics? Well, I'd had this kind of idea that cellular automata could be used to make sort of a discrete approximation to fluids. And then I developed that idea and in fact was running it on the connection machine computer. This notion of having sort of discrete computational molecules and then scaling that up to see sort of fluid behavior. It was kind of fun in those days. I have to say one of the things that perhaps was a mistake was that I wasn't the one kind of diving in and writing the low-level, essentially machine-like code for the connection machine to implement some of these things. That arguably was a mistake, but in any case, that was the way it worked. And I have to remember one time we're doing this fluid simulation and some piece of the fluid somehow suddenly explodes and has very high velocity fields and so on. And we realized that was actually a processor in the connection machine kind of exploding and doing crazy things. Well, I think I am led to tell a sub-story here about uses of the connection machine. I remember being interested. I was really interested in Rule 30 and so on. And the thinking machines had this very large format printer that was used for printing out circuit schematics and things like this. So I printed out at very high resolution a connection machine generated Rule 30, giant printout, was lying on the floor. And Dick Feynman was there. And it's kind of, we had this, we were trying to figure out various features of Rule 30. Rule 30 has this kind of space between randomness and order that has a sort of line that's approximate line at a certain angle. The angle is approximately a quarter. And Dick Feynman had this argument. In fact, I still even have his notes from this about why it should be exactly a quarter. Turned out it isn't exactly a quarter. It's like 0.2481 or something. But I remember after sort of messing around trying to figure out those angles and things with this big printout on the floor, Dick Feynman kind of pulls me aside rather conspiratorially and says, just tell me, how did you know that this Rule 30 thing was going to do all this very complicated random stuff that it does? And so I said, well, I didn't know. I just ran a bunch of computer experiments and found that. And so he said, oh, then I feel much better. I thought you had some kind of intuition that would tell you that that's how things had to work out. And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm just a sort of explorer of the computational universe. I don't think I used those terms in those days, but that was the thrust of it. In any case, so as a result of trying to find something practical to do with the connection machine, invented this method for doing fluid dynamics with cellular automata that was used to sort of promote the connection machine to government labs and things like this with some success. Meanwhile, that turned into a big hairy mess. Perhaps I'll tell that story, and then that will be the last one for my day today. So I invented this thing. Meanwhile, actually from that conference that I mentioned, the Nobel Foundation conference back in '84, I had met a bunch of people who did turbulence research. A chap called Uriel Frisch was a notable one. And I had said, well, I'm sort of vaguely thinking about cellular automata for turbulence. And they're like, no, couldn't possibly work. Bad idea. Turbulence is all about singularities of these continuous mathematical functions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, I don't think you know what turbulence is really all about. But anyway, so then I go off and start doing this. And somehow I was interacting with folks at Los Alamos, particularly an aforementioned Basil Haslacher, who was kind of a high-risk physicist who was at that time working at Los Alamos. And somehow, as this whole thing starts to spin up and Thinking Machines is using this sort of cellular automaton fluids thing to sell connection machines and maybe including to Los Alamos and so on. Meanwhile, somehow Uriel Frisch is somehow getting involved and Basil Haslacher is involved. And then another character who I mentioned before, Tsutomu Shimomura, who I had known when he was a very young chap at Caltech, who'd sort of been a computer security guy, had wound up at Los Alamos, continually having to be fished out of trouble for kind of breaking into classified computers and things. But anyway, he was kind of put to work on sort of making a optimized for a Cray supercomputer version of this cellular automaton fluids kind of thing. Well, then, sort of the race was on and people were trying to simulate this thing. And actually, I was surprised by how well it worked and had a bunch of simulations going. And then the folks at Los Alamos had simulations going, and it became a big kind of a big race. And because the official turbulence incumbents wanted to be the ones to discover anything there was to discover about turbulence. Then in the middle of the whole thing was kind of a crazy curveball that got thrown, which was, people were working on this and so on and so on and so on. Suddenly there appeared this article on the front page of the Washington Post about how this method for fluid dynamics had been invented, and it had been, at Los Alamos, and there was all this talk about how it was going to be classified, and the Soviets wouldn't get it, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, years later, I found out that story was actually placed by John Gage, the aforementioned person from Sun Microsystems, who had prior to that time, before he was at Sun, he was a political operative. He was in Washington, D.C., and he had known these various reporters and so on. And somehow this was some kind of complicated, entangled story of Sun Microsystems was all about sort of open computing, because they were trying to break out of the kind of the closed operating systems, and they had this open operating system. Later, they would do Java as kind of the, an open thing. And this was kind of a open science sort of kind of push. Anyway, this article on the front page of the Washington Post was a disaster, because I think it led to, complaints by the French ambassador that the French turbulence people had been cut out of the thing. It led to this sort of huge race of people being convinced that somebody was going to win a Nobel Prize for this random idea of mine, and not that, and so great intensity. Wasn't helped by the fact that in Princeton, I knew a chap called Steve Orzag, who was an applied mathematician who had done a lot on fluid mechanics, who was right at that moment in the process of raising money for a traditional fluid mechanics company. And so he was really keen to sort of prove this new method wouldn't work and not have his investors be confused by the article in the Washington Post and so on. It did a surprising amount of damage. And in the end, it was it was actually my last effort in by that point I had published a bunch of many academic papers, more than 50 by that time. And I had noticed that the ones that were kind of creative always had the most trouble. And so I had taken the strategy of just, get on the editorial board of any journal I'm really going to publish papers in. And so I did that and published a bunch of papers in such journals. But then this fluid mechanics thing, a journal that I wasn't on the editorial board of, Physical Review Letters, was the one that I sent this to because it was sort of the obvious one. And it was sort of the subject of intense political maneuvering. And eventually I got completely fed up and just said, look, this is all nonsense. Everybody knows perfectly well this is, a weird, political credit play type thing. But look, I'm not going to publish my paper there. And by the way, I'm never going to publish a paper in an academic journal again. That was 1986, and I've never published a paper in an academic journal again. There's a little bit more color to that story. I think I wrote a little bit about that story a couple of years ago. There's some more dramatic turns, I think, that happened, which I'm now forgetting all the details of. But in any case, that was the sort of science story. Actually, at that time, I started a journal as part of my starting an institute. I started a journal called Complex Systems that was still going today. So I'm sort of 1986. I'm kind of on the brink of starting this complex systems research, Center for Complex Systems Research. I should mention, sort of as a footnote to that, back in 1984, there had been this thing called the Santa Fe, well, it was called at that time the Rio Grande Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that David Pines was involved with, actually, along with Murray Gell-Mann and a bunch of other physics characters. And they had invited me to kind of their launch event I went to, and it was mostly a bunch of 60-something-year-olds kind of sitting around discussing, when we raise $2 billion as an endowment, how will we build a great interdisciplinary university? And my notable contribution was saying rather sheepishly, because everybody else had been talking about, we should do this, we should do that. And I was like, what are you going to do if you only raise a much smaller amount of money? I do have a suggestion. It's do stuff to do with complex systems, which ended up being the theme for the Santa Fe Institute. At that time, they were maybe a little bit after that. It must have been right when I was starting CCSR, the Center for Complex Systems Research. They were sort of trying to recruit me to be kind of a director of research for what became the Santa Fe Institute, and I was not convinced. It seemed too much like a retired physicists having homes in Santa Fe and not a serious operation. But it's turned out to do much better than I expected. I'm going to have to go in a very short time. This question from Lou. In the 80s, what would Stephen wear to the lab? I don't think I was, I think I've been wearing depressingly similar kinds of clothes all this time. I think I lost the sometime corduroy jackets, and I gained the modern kinds of shoes that weren't Birkenstocks and things. But I think I've been rather boring and generic all that time. Paul asks, how did people react when you started venturing into business? Oh, people were surprised and like, how can you possibly do that? You do all this basic science. How could you do those kinds of things? let's see. Uh, Elsie is asking about Freeman Dyson, subsequent interactions with George Dyson or Esther. Uh, Esther Dyson is kind of a technology person. I did interact with her in the late 80s. I remember her, she was quite well known in the tech industry. I remember her sort of leaving a phone message or something and saying she was Freeman Dyson's daughter, which I didn't think, I knew who she was perfectly well because she was a fixture in the tech industry. And I thought it was rather charming that she was introducing herself that way. George Dyson, I hadn't met until just a few years ago. I saw Freeman for the last time a few years ago. I hadn't seen him in decades. And I have to say, we had a curiously um, uh, disappointing interaction, so to speak, about in which, in fact, it's even recorded in an email because I kind of followed up, in which he was like, I've always thought the stuff you were doing was total nonsense, he said. And I was like, then you were a coward for not telling me that back in the 1980s because you never told me that at that time. So that was kind of my um, um, not so great interaction. Question from Harry, did you ever meet Martin Gardner? Unfortunately, I did not. We exchanged letters, but we never met in person. Let's see. Okay, I think that's a bunch of questions, but that's it for today. I'm actually going to go and I'm trying to rush through my life, so I'm going to go on tomorrow, and hopefully we are now finally in the mid 1980s, and hopefully we will accelerate from here. But thanks for listening, and it's kind of strangely cathartic for me to tell all these stories. I'm sure I'm forgetting a large fraction of them, but hopefully fun to hear about. All right, thanks very much, and bye for now.